In one respect, at least in one respect, Paul, from the standpoint of the people that he was with and his customs and his ways, regardless of the message, Paul was very much different from the popular teachers of the time. As a matter of fact, those people who study that subject, the popular preachers or teachers that move from city to city, they generally were called philosophers. But they were shallow philosophers at best. But still, they seem to have reached a peak in their influence, their numbers, their pervasiveness, about the time of the first century, about the time that Paul would have been traveling from place to place. They're mentioned in the Roman literature, they're mentioned at Corinth, they're mentioned at Ephesus, and in many of the Greek cities, even Latin cities like Rome. Some of these philosopher teachers, as you can imagine, would get even that far. But Paul wants to make a clear distinction between himself and his way of life, his way of behavior, his manner of dealing with converts. Wants to make a clear distinction between himself and the teacher philosophers that the people of the cities in the Greco-Roman world, how they knew those people. Paul is adamant he did not come simply to make converts. Paul came to make communities, and he wanted the community and the people to be there after he left. So when he left Ephesus, or when he left Thessalonica and went down to Berea, Paul left behind him at Berea Timothy and Silas and went to Athens by himself, because Paul wanted Timothy and Silas to build up the communities. Apparently there were churches not only at Thessalonica and Berea, but there came to be churches in other towns. The Bible does say that Paul passed by Apollonius and Apollonia and Amphipolis on the way from Philippi. But the reason he apparently passed by those cities was because they had no synagogue. Paul, after being at Philippi, where there was no synagogue, only Lydia and her family, who knew something about the God of Israel, but still were not altogether Jews. I think that we ought to think of Lydia as part of the Sabomenoi, the pious ones, and not of a full-fledged Jewish woman. But she was worshiping God on the Sabbath day, and insofar as she could, she observed the laws of the Jewish people. But of course, there were some places where she had difficulties doing that. I suppose the dietary laws, certainly with things like circumcision, she had very little contact with the Jews. But still, the Jews taught a way of life and a kind of respect for other people, a respect for human life that was not found in the pagan religions of the world of the day. And so there were many of those Sabomenoi. I may have mentioned it before, but I have come across figures that would indicate that in the Roman world, nearly a fifth or a sixth or a seventh of the population was Jewish. Well, if you count all the Sabomenoi, maybe, of the pious ones, but surely not ethnic Jews that numerous in the Roman-speaking world. There are people who speculate about the population that there was in the whole of the Roman world at the time. But it's largely speculation. There were in those days censuses might well be taken, but its reliability and all was much different than we're used to in the modern world. But Paul was determined when he went to Thessalonica that he was to leave behind a community. The fact that the Jews, some of the Jews of the synagogue, and I believe that Paul was in Thessalonica longer than 3 weeks, 3 Sabbath days, but for 3 Sabbath days it says that he was able to contend with the Jews. The Jews allowed him to speak, gave him time to speak in the synagogues. After that, he had nothing to do with the synagogue. But you can be sure that there were a number of people that were converted by the mention of Jason. The people that were hired to try to find Paul and others and to persecute them, the people that were hired, the Bible calls them people of the marketplace. You know, they were ruffians who hung out in the marketplace and who were up to be hired by anybody. And the Jews gave them a certain amount of money, agreed with them, and they assaulted the house of Jason. And Jason is a thoroughgoing Greek name. And so it is, but I doubt that he had any connection whatsoever with Judaism. He may have been among the Sabomenoi, the pious ones, but he was hauled, Jason and those with him were hauled before the magistrates of the city. Paul didn't just neglect them. He didn't just forget about them. He was on his way. The church had already sent him on his way to Berea. And so he and Silas and Timothy got out of town as the situation required them to be. But in getting out of town, they didn't just leave behind the church at Thessalonica. Paul knew nothing about the church of Thessalonica, lost contact with them, probably in the space of a year. He mentions in his letter, and it is mentioned in Acts, that Timothy and Silas continued to work in that area. And Paul was in Athens by himself, and then traveled to Corinth and was by himself. This is where he met Aquila and Priscilla for the first time. And so Paul for some time worked with the church, tried to build up the church, a Christian community in Corinth, when he had left behind Athens. Nothing is said of a church in Athens. Presumably the philosophical orientation of the city, or they had come on so many people like Paul, so many philosopher teachers, that they just paid no attention to it. Paul never was able to establish. It does mention a couple of people, right at the end of Acts 17, but very few people were converted to Christ. We have no letter to the church at Athens as we do at Corinth, for example, or even Ephesus. And so Paul was by himself at Athens and Corinth, while Timothy and Silas continued to work at Thessalonica and Berea, and I suppose churches at other places in that area, though we can't be absolutely sure about that. Later on in 2 Corinthians, Paul is trying to raise money in those churches, in Macedonia, for the poor in Jerusalem. But the chances are that there had been churches in that area for some time beforehand. And so Paul, after he went on to Corinth, he is joined, Acts tells us this, that he was joined by Silas and Timothy. They came down from Macedonia. And so Paul got word through Silas and Timothy about how the church was developing in Thessalonica. They had some problems, you can imagine, a new church trying to find out. There's no New Testament to leave in their hand. All they know about Christ is what Paul has told them. And so Paul writes them a letter. And you see, the writing of the letter, that's what 1 Thessalonians in 2nd Thessalonians is, Paul writes because he wants to try to strengthen, he wants to build on the foundation that he has started. Probably just a few Christians in Thessalonica. But Thessalonica was a large city. It was a seat of Roman government. That's where the proconsul had his office. And so Thessalonica was a very important city. It was a fairly new city, as the Greeks would count it. Thessalonica had not been there. It was established by some of Alexander the Great's generals. And so Thessalonica had not been there too long. But it was a large city, a prosperous city. And Paul wants a church there, apparently because from a central location, the church can spread out and grow among towns that surround it, smaller towns that surround it. And so Paul starts out in chapter 2 of Thessalonians, of 1 Thessalonians, "For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. But after we had already suffered and been mistreated in Philippi, as you know, we had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid much opposition." And so Paul appeals to his example, as he might well have. When I came among you, you know what kind of teacher I don't fit in the same category of the philosophers that you went into the marketplace to hear. You know that I was interested in you, and I partook of the way of life. I didn't just ask you for money. See, I was like a nurse. He says that in verses. He says, "But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, who examines our hearts. For we never came with flattering speech, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness." So you see, Paul is drawing the distinction as sharply as he can between himself and the popular philosopher teachers that made their way from city to city, that the people of Thessalonica and Corinth and Athens and Berea, all the towns, would have been very familiar with. Paul is wanting to draw a distinction clearly between himself and them. "We never came to you with flattering speech," he says. That wasn't our appeal. It may have been the appeal of many who came your way, but not us. And it wasn't with greed. That wasn't our aim. God is our witness, Paul says. So you know what kind of people we were when we were among you. And then he says in verse 6, "Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, even though as apostles of Christ we might have asserted our authority." Now, I take it that Paul believes that as an apostle of Christ and as a preacher of the gospel, he had the right to ask the church in Thessalonica or any other place, Corinth, any other. He had the right to ask for them to provide for his physical needs while he preached Christ. But he said, I didn't use that. I didn't ask you for anything. But he says in verse 7, "We proved to be gentle among you." Now, there is in the Greek language, I think there's an insight that we get into the oldest copies that we have of the Greek New Testament from that verse. The oldest copies of the New Testament that we have, the oldest copies of Thessalonians, there is no space between words, and everything is written in capital letters. It is hard to read. I've tried to read some of it at times, and it maybe isn't as difficult as you think it might be, but it is hard. It's difficult when we're used to spaces between words and capitalization. There are a number of things that we do in our English language when we write or when we read a book that are different from the way the ancient world did reading and writing. And normally where you define divide a word is clear enough. The context makes it clear what word we're speaking of, where the word is to be broken. You have to depend on context when there is no space between words. But there's a case here where the word for child, for children, and the word for nurses in Greek are very close to the same. The only difference is that one of them begins with a noon, which is an N word. It looks like a V in English. But a word, many words end in that. A common ending is we did such and such. And the common ending is men, ending with that N sound. And so the difference between saying nurses, we were nurses among you, and we were children among you, depends on where you put that new. Whether you put it with the previous word and have it we, or whether you put it with the word that follows. And so in this case, it makes sense either way. We were children among you. Paul may be talking about his asserting his authority in just the context. He had been talking about authority. And so he may have said, we were children. The greatest among you shall be least among you, Jesus had said. And so Paul may be referring to an attitude that he had among them. But on the other hand, the context suggests a female orientation. That whole verse, for we prove to be gentle among you as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. And so it may well be that Paul is comparing himself to a nurse who brought along a Christian family. And so either context, you see, or whether we say nurses or children, either one of them may find sense. But there's a difference. I mean, Paul intended one or the other words to be used. Most of the translations say, take it as something like a nurse. Very few of them take it as children. But the Greek does present something of a problem there, and you won't read a commentary anywhere without some discussion of both of those words being a possibility. So it could be napioi, it could be apioi. In either case, nurses or children, it makes sense, but it's hard to know which Paul intended. But the sense of a nurse makes fine sense. Now we think of a nurse probably in a hospital. In the ancient world, a nurse would be a nursing mother. And so Paul says that he was like a nursing mother to the children, trying to help the church there grow like a child would grow who nursed from his mother. So that's the sense, I think, of verse 7. And for lack of better information, I think most of the translations have it right. It seems to me that the context suggests nursing. Paul says, having so fond an affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. You see what Paul is saying? I don't want you to mistake me as a traveling philosopher teacher that sort of comes into town and spends some time in the marketplace and gets whatever money he can accumulate and wins a few people to his way of thinking and then skirts off to the next town. I don't want you to think of me in those. I'm not going to forget you, Paul says. You see, you're my people. I gave you birth. I have led you in Christ. I have taught you. I've nurtured you. And Paul says, you can look at my example. You don't have to take my word for it. You should know from the example that you saw in me that there was something more involved here than my simply coming in and wanting to use whatever doctrine of Christ that I had in order to make a few dollars. And so Paul says, "For you recall, brethren, our labor and hardships." And I expect he's talking about, I don't know, there's nothing said in Acts about his being a builder of tents like Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth. But Paul obviously had some skills. You know, when it became necessary, Paul became a plumber or an electrician or whatever he needed to become in order to earn his own way. You can imagine, can't you? Coming to a city like Corinth or like Thessalonica or Corinth, the apostle is not likely to find a group of people who are ready to provide for him, to supply his material needs, his food, and a place for him to live over a long period of time. Somebody might give him a few days while he's on his journey, but it is unlikely that they're going to care for him. And so Paul says, "You remember my work and my hardships, how working night and day, so as not to be a burden to any of you. I didn't want you to have to take care of me," Paul says. And so Paul's method of teaching was altogether different. I've tried to relate Paul's experience there. If a missionary today goes into a place where there are no Christians at all, the chances are he has a church back home who's supplying his basic needs and who can, right from the beginning, spend his full-time efforts as trying to build a church. And that's more difficult than you might think. I mean, what do you do when you go into a city like Corinth, maybe to go into Philadelphia or a New York City, and there isn't a person there who knows anything about Jesus of Nazareth? Now, there may be synagogues. You might be able to use the synagogue as a kind of starting place, and Paul does on a number of occasions. And I believe that there is something to the idea that God had prepared the world, that providentially Christianity began at a time when people were open to the message of Christ. The Jews had spread throughout the world of those days. There were synagogues in a lot of places. The Bible mentions a synagogue in Corinth, and there's a synagogue at Athens, and there's a synagogue at Berea and at Thessalonica. Now, there isn't one in a lot of towns, too. I suppose that he passed by Amphipolis and Apollonia because he was looking for a place where there was a synagogue, and there apparently was none in those cities. But they were were large cities in the Greek-speaking world. And so Paul wanted to remind the Christians of Thessalonica how he had lived among them, because Paul didn't have a New Testament to leave with them. The only thing that he could do was teach by his example. And Paul says, I wasn't averse to that. I was ready to teach by my example when it was necessary. And he did. He worked hard when he was among them. He showed them that he was not just after their money, or there was no greedy motive that he had. He didn't flatter them with his speech. He didn't just try to get a few dollars and go out of town. This letter is a testimony to the church at Thessalonica of his love, of his concern for the converts that he had made for Christ. And there was, the church prospered at Thessalonica. It is interesting that there aren't very many references, but there are occasionally we come across somebody in the book of Acts who is from Thessalonica. And so the church there became a kind of center place. Corinth was a city like that, as was Ephesus. And I expect that Paul may have selected cities that he saw as kind of radiating points from which the gospel would be made known to that part of the world. It is certainly true that at least in Asia Minor, Colossae is located, the 7 churches of Asia where John apparently worked. it is certainly true that that there in the early, in the 2nd century of Christianity, important heresies and important teachers came from that part of the world. And so next to Rome, the church grew in Rome, apparently. And then in Asia Minor was sort of the Christian land par excellence, as the people have spoken about it. And Thessalonica must have been a place like that too, as Corinth was. But it was a long and a hard struggle. Thessalonians gives me encouragement and hope, because in it I can see what preachers then did, what they endured in order to preach Christ to a world that knew nothing about him. Even the Jews knew very little about Jesus of Nazareth. But through Paul's preaching, it's, you wonder if he had any sense, if Paul had any sense that in 300 or 400 years the Roman Empire would be Christian. But Paul started the whole thing, and the Roman Empire, the United States of America, wherever there are people who adore the name of Christ. There are a lot of different sects out there in the world, and we want there to be unity among those who confess the name of Christ. But in the absence of that, it is still true that the Christian land, that there are more Christians in the earth, or people who would call themselves Christians at least, than there is of any other religious tribe. There have been many scholars who pointed out that the 19th century was the great Christian century. The 1800s, when preachers, missionaries were going out from Great Britain and the United States and every other nation that would have anything to do with it. Thank you for listening today.